I think we can go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third in our FSMA 204 series. This time, we are no longer speculating what the final regulation is going to be because it has been officially released. So it's a whopping 597 pages worth of detail and clarification that Jason Varney and I and many others in the industry have been poring over for the last week. Of course, downing lots of coffee to get through it in my case. But today we're going to highlight for you some of our big takeaways, the big updates from our first pass through the regulation. And then we're going to talk about what you can be focusing on. So some actions that you can be taking today to start to get yourself in a good place and prepared for this new set of rules. As always, we'll close with Q&A, but please feel free to submit your questions throughout. I'll try and keep an eye on those in my second monitor here as they're coming in. You can submit those questions in that Q&A section that I've highlighted here. And then we'll do our best to either address them in the moment or at the end of the presentation. So let's start with the good stuff, FSMA 204 updates. So much of the basics of the regulation are unchanged. This slide should look very familiar to anyone that joined a previous session with us. FSMA 204 requires data to be electronically organized, not manually, with a turnaround time of 24 hours of a request. The language here is a little bit ambiguous, so I actually pulled it up here. They say when necessary to help prevent or mitigate a foodborne illness outbreak, assist in the implementation of a recall, or otherwise address a threat to the public health. So it's a little ambiguous, but in general, I think it's just a good idea to assume all of these use cases could come up and be prepared with any of the FTL food categories that you trade. FTL, of course, means Food Traceability List. It is the list of items that fall under the regulation. No changes were made in the final version to add or remove any items on the list, but they did add a whole bunch of detail in the descriptions. They broke things out in different areas to provide clarity in areas where there seemed to be a lot of questions and confusion or difficulty in identifying whether or not a product was on the FTL or not. So we will go through all of that in a minute here. Before I do, a couple more acronyms that are important. CTEs are critical tracking events. Those represent the points at which data needs to be collected. And then what data needs to be collected, that's going to be your KDEs, your key data elements. There were some changes to these, to the CTEs and the KDEs. So we will elaborate on those changes as we go through. But before we do that, let's first talk about timing. So a lot of pushback was given on timing. There's challenges as to whether or not this could truly be accomplished in that 2-year time frame. And based on that feedback, one of the bigger changes here is going to be related to that timeline. So now we're going to be talking 3 years instead of the original 2 years that was in the proposal. That's going to put us at a compliance date of January 2026. So that's good news in general, right? We have more time. But to me, that doesn't really change much about the urgency here in preparation, ensuring that we can get all of the necessary activities in place, the infrastructure in place. There's a lot of different players that we need to get up and running and across that finish line in time. So this is a team effort, right? There's a lot to do in that time frame. The clock is ticking. That's especially true when we look at the section on enforcement. And there, it's been made really clear the outcome of lack of compliance, which was pretty uncertain before. We weren't sure if it would be fines or what that might look like. So according to the final rule, FSMA 204 and Subpart S will fall under Section 301E of the FD&C Act. So as such, there is the potential for civil or criminal action in federal court as enforcement to the regulation. Of course, that's not going to be the first outcome. They did list that it's generally the FDA's practice to give individuals and firms an opportunity to take prompt and voluntary corrective action before enforcement. But, it certainly highlights the teeth on this thing and the need to start moving toward a solution as quickly as you can if you are trading FTL items. What are the FTL items? So let's take a look and let's look at the changes here. If you attended a previous session, you'll remember that I used to be able to fit all of the FTL items on one slide, but now there's so much detail that I've had to expand this out to 2. I actually tried to fit it all on one, but I couldn't make it happen and still make it readable. So this is one of 2 slides outlining the FTL items. So let's talk about what changed. So first of all, cheese has gotten a lot of attention. Not just more detail, but breaking this out into several categories. Each one of those categories has more robust descriptions to address all of the comments that came up in this cheese section. With our nut butters, they have added more detail, better examples for what's meant by quote unquote all types. You can see those examples listed out there. We also have more detail and references for herbs, for sprouts, for melons, and for leafy greens. And leafy greens have actually been broken out into 2 types as well. So providing some better distinction between fresh and fresh cut and the associated details and examples there. On to the rest of the FTL. So this is page 2 here. 2 other groups have been broken out at the line level to provide better distinction. So fresh cut is now broken into fresh cut fruits and fresh cut veggies, other than leafy greens, with the associated detail for those. And then finfish is now also multiple lines to address all the questions that came up here, including a completely separate line there for smoked. So we get all that distinction, all of those details, a lot of additional clarity in the descriptions there for those. You also see more robust descriptions given for tropical tree fruits, for mollusks, and for ready-to-eat deli salads. So hopefully with all of this additional detail, including the references and the exemption lists and the examples, it should be a fairly straightforward exercise to leverage all of this material as you're reviewing your items that you trade, identify any of those areas where you're going to fall under the regulation. It'll still take time, of course, to go through your catalogs and do this exercise, but the clarity really seems to be there now. So I think they've done a really nice job there. Okay. When it comes to CTEs and KDEs, those are your critical tracking events and key data elements. We do have quite a few changes here. So I'll just highlight some of the big ones for today. First receiver was a CTE previously, and we spent some time on these in webinars. So if you ran our past webinars, we talked through what first receiver meant. We went through all of the nuances there, but now that CTE is gone, but it's being replaced by this initial packer CTE. And the initial packer is going to be responsible for the information on origination, harvesting, cooling, and packing of food. So this should cut out a lot of the confusion that whole concept of a first receiver introduced. Initial packer is pretty clear about what's expected. So we're pretty excited about that one. If you find yourself in this category of needing to capture this type of information, iTrade, of course, can help. We have solutions in place that are ready and able to get you what you need, including harvest operation solutions for that cut to cool, our best in breed labeling solutions. So you can see some of those pictured here. This is for our case and pallet labels. And with those, you're going to get out of the box harmonized PTI case labels. Those are going to be consistent with industry standards. So you'll be all set for the information you need to capture. And then we also have several methods for helping to connect that data and that information for your trading partners. So you'll be able to share those fields and records that will be required of buyers as part of receiving KDEs that buyers will be on the hook for per the regulation. So like I said, this is a team effort kind of regulation. It's not just about protecting yourself against the enforcement. It's also about being a good trading partner, setting up those infrastructures to be able to share the information to your trading partners, whether they're upstream, whether they're downstream, It doesn't matter. We have methods and capabilities for helping to share in whatever direction and format you need. Okay, so back to the changes. Another big change comes in the combination of CTEs. So before we had a creation CTE and a transformation CTE. Those were a little bit confusing. There was a lot of overlap conceptually between the two of them. So they have now been combined into a single transformation CTE that should cover all of the context of what was previously separate. So that should reduce some of that confusion. For the traceability plan, with some exceptions, suppliers will also need to keep a farm map showing where food is grown or raised, including geographic coordinates for the growing raising area. There was also a lot of pushback on information protection. And so now the regulation enables privacy to be maintained by offering alternative methods like references through which information on the traceability lot code source can be made available to the FDA while still maintaining that privacy. So that's a couple of the big ones. We're going to keep going through this. We'll continue to bring forth those changes that we see and the nuances to these rules in future sessions. So we will continue to keep digging in on this and reporting back with our findings. But next thing I want to do for today is just focus on some of the things that you can be doing to get started. So I mentioned some of the areas where iTrade has solutions that can be easily applied in your organization to get you started. But you know, one of the really important first steps that everyone should be taking at this point is identifying a resource. So if you don't already have someone who's focused on FSMA 204, it's a really, really critical first step to take. I'm hoping that most of the folks that are on with us today, that you're here because you are that person, that resource for your company. But if you haven't already appointed someone, or if your organization hasn't already appointed someone, it's a really important first step to do. Once you have that person in place, or if you are that person, you can start step 2 here, which is figuring out where you're going to fall under FSMA 204. Where are you impacted? What categories are under FTL? So really looking at your catalog, referencing the FTL, referencing all of the exemptions, and there were some changes to the exemptions too, so it's worth taking another look at those, and coming up with a really clear reference plan for what items you trade that are on that list. And so I put together a little example here, you know, understanding what products are going to fall under that regulation, what products are not going to fall under that regulation, so that you have kind of that map to start from. From there, you can start to expand on that and begin identifying the workflows, you know, where you fall on those workflows. What are the CTEs? What are the KDEs? Where do you have data gaps that you have today that you need to kind of fill in, so that you can arrive at this really solid framework or battle plan for tackling this regulation? Because as we covered in previous sessions, you may be on the hook for some CTEs and KDEs in some cases with some products, and that might be an entirely different workflow for others. So you really need to take the time and sit down and think through these things. And at iTrade, we are more than happy to engage with you. So as you start going through, if you have questions, you know, whatever one of those steps that I outlined you're on, this is something we started focusing on over a decade ago, because we knew that this was going to be important. So over a decade ago, we started designing solutions to help with data capture, designing solutions to help with data sharing, continuing to evolve and innovate on those solutions. And you can see that today, the solution suite that you see pictured here is really that evolution of things that we've been doing for a very long time, new capabilities that we've added to expand that solution suite. All of these things are modular. So you may talk to us and find that you need just one. You might only need to figure out how to send the data. You may need to also get case labels. You may need to look at other solutions in here, but they are modular. So we're happy to work with you, figure out what you need, where the gaps are, and how to help solution against it. And that's true whether you're a grower shipper, a manufacturer, a broker, buyer, operator. We have options for everyone within the supply chain when it comes to traceability. And we really do want to help you come into compliance so that this doesn't have to be an area of heavy focus or concern for you moving forward, and that we can put these things in place well ahead of that deadline. And with the release of our TrueTrack solution, which is our latest release, we make it even easier and faster to get the information that you need. So thinking about that regulation, the rapid turnaround time, the need for digital records, we have the ability to very quickly query the data, provide configurable reports that will contain all of the information that's needed, do so really easily. So I actually have a quick little demo here of what that would look like, where, if I need to quickly identify products, I can create a new trace data report. Let's say I have some lot codes, selecting that lot number, whether it's one, whether it's multiple. I'll plug in a couple of letters here and we can pull that up. Selecting the lot, so I'll choose a couple of these here and we can click apply. And this is going to allow me to see exactly where I'm impacted. So it took those 3 lot codes, queried my data, and returned to me that visualization of where those products came from, where they ended up, the summary level detail, for the lots that I selected. They impacted a total of 3 products, a total of 48 purchase orders across 3 different customers. So giving me all of that summary level detail about the impact. And then also allowing me to kind of scroll down and get more detail there. So wanting to know exactly which customers were impacted, how many POs. These are things that I can drill in on too. So having all of that detail available, being able to see the number of cases on each order, being able to see the total cases, total POs, the statuses of those things. Really important to be able to do this and to be able to do it quickly like this and search through that information. This is something that I can save, come back to later. It's something that I can share with others. So if I need to export this out into an Excel sheet or share it as a report to someone, going to have that capability right out of the box. So I'll save that. Obviously we make this look very easy. This is something, like I said, we've been doing for a very long time. So we really do understand these things. Jason is probably even better than me by a long shot in digesting this information and being able to provide guidance on what things fall under FSMA 204 and areas where we can address some of those questions. And so I genuinely mean this when I say we are very interested in helping. If you have questions, email us. Our email is up there. We're happy to jump on a quick consult with you and talk through your questions or your concerns around this. But of course, we are also happy to answer some of those questions today. So let's jump into that Q&A. All right. So, Jason, maybe you want to take a stab at this first question. They're asking for a little bit of clarity around the initial packer responsibility.
Yeah, I see that. And so I guess it depends on if they're packing the product or if they're receiving it already packed. If you're basically if you're just a warehouse that pulls product in and ships it out and it's the same form that you receive it, then you would not necessarily be the initial packer of that. And so you would be responsible for the receiving KDEs and then the shipping KDEs when you ship it out to the folks that you're selling it to. So the way I'm interpreting these couple questions are that it's, if it's the warehouse, I guess that's kind of depends as my answer. Depends on if you're actually packing it or if you're just bringing it through.
Yeah, so I would encourage the person that asked this question. We'd be happy to jump on a call with you. I see that there's a couple of questions coming from one resource here. So,
yeah, I definitely think we should follow up on a call with this individual here. But and then the last question there about clients that use our traceability solution, are going to be able to share the shipping KDEs, capture the required KDEs and share those across any of their buyers, regardless if they are, getting the purchase orders through iTrade or not. So the ability for the trace solution to capture and share the required KDEs for FSMA is not does not require that the buyer leverage the order management system to receive those.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to double down on here too, because you want to make sure that the solution that you have moving forward is not a partial solution for some of your orders. So we do enable that to flow through whether or not your buyers are on iTrade. Okay. We have a question here about how to make sure suppliers are sending the right information. So I'm assuming this is the other side of things. This person is either working for a retailer or a restaurant. Just as your suppliers will need to understand their impact on a product by product basis, you're also going to need to know which suppliers and which products require what data. So going through that same exercise, finding the areas where you fall under the regulation, and then figuring out where you're going to be impacted. But the good news is that this can all be, once you have that understanding of the impact, this can all be automated and handled through workflow. So this is something, for all of the trading partners in the supply chain, we've put a lot of thought over the past few years, knowing that this sort of thing was coming, into designing those solutions for all of our trading partners and how they're going to be impacted.
Yeah, and this question does come up quite a bit. So iTrade does offer a variety of solutions for different aspects of the relationship between suppliers and buyers and producers, logistics partners, et cetera. And for the most part, are solutions that are not directly. There's many solutions not directly tied to the ordering solution. A lot of times there's a value added if the buyer supplier relationship is on OMS. However, it's not constrained to require that, I guess is a good way of putting that. So that's, that has come up over the years. And so we've been mindful to make sure that we do provide on a supplier comprehensiveness of supplier-based solutions, that they are not limited to use that solution just for the OMS buyers. And then I have a couple notes. We got a little bit of time. I got a couple of notes as well as I was going through the final rule of FSMA. Some things jumped out at me where, for example, they don't require anymore for a firm or company that is subject to the rule to maintain a list of FTL products that they sell or handle. And even though certain things like that may not be in the rule, we do still advise that at least in our catalogs that we maintain from an order management and a traceability perspective, that we are going to enable flags, to support the indicator that it is an FTL item, because we will put rules in place around the traceability data sharing that prevent, for example, a shipment to be sent without the required KDEs for FSMA if it's got products on there that are subject to the rule. One of the things that came up, Sarah had mentioned maintaining a farm or growing location map. That's pretty significant change on the final rule from the proposed rule. The proposed rule really wanted, for each traceability lot code to have indication down to the GPS coordinates or address of the actual growing location. There was a lot of pushback on that because a lot of times there's a lot of competition for growers, for example, in certain commodities, and companies that have built over time relationships with their growing partners don't necessarily want the location of these growing partners to be shared, throughout the sharing that they do with their trading partners, because at the end of the day, that might end up in a situation where other companies are approaching their network of growers and trying to work out deals with them and potentially for lack of a better term, steal their growers. So that's now been taken to where only the FDA, if they're asked, would be given a map, kind of to relating those traceability lot codes to the geographical where that came from. One big piece of pushback that I'd heard over time with the proposed rule and some of the feedback that the industry had been providing was around protection of personal information, especially contact information and names. The proposed rule, had called out that you really needed to put the name and contact number or email of the person that created lot codes, and the grower themselves and things like that. Now it's really taken up to more of a high level contact, meaning now the final rule requires that, for example, if you're a shipper, you would just need to identify like what's the contact information for the department in your organization that handles the FSMA inquiries, rather than like an individual's name and contact. And so there's been, I was pretty impressed with like some of the bigger pain points that were identified by industry when the proposed rule came out. What you see is that FDA was responsive to those, and kind of came up with some creative ideas to still keep the spirit of what they're looking for, and the functionality that they want to perform these quick tracebacks and recalls, but to keep in mind the pushback in terms of being more reasonable with what they're asking for, so that it doesn't lead to more problems. There was an aspect of for companies to import, for example, there's like an entry number and some certain things with customs that were part of the proposed rule that were going to be somewhat difficult to track throughout the entire supply chain to all the way to the store, for example. Some of that's been removed. And so I think at the end of the day, at least my high level takeaway is that the final rule is a lot more simplified and manageable than some of the things that we would see in the proposed rule if we tried to implement those.
Yeah, I completely agree. I just saw another interesting question come through where the question is, if we sell a variety of products and only one of our products falls under the regulation, do you think customers will still want this type of traceability in all commodities
Yeah,
regardless?
I see that.
This is a great question. And this really speaks to, I know we have a couple buyers on the line here today. This really speaks to the buyer access to data, and what we've been seeing as a trend is that as this traceability data becomes more and more prevalent and available to not just our buying communities, but throughout the supply chain, it's enabling us to do some really value added things with the data, like managing inventory and using things like harvest dates that come through as part of this FSMA regulation to figure out how we're best going to allocate product to stores and how we're best going to manage inventory. If you kind of play that out through all of the different nodes in the supply chain, there's a ton of value that can be added through this type of data. So we expect for this this interest in data to not just rest with FSMA 204, but to continue to expand as we learn from the data and learn what we can do with it to add value to all throughout the supply chain.
Yeah, my note on that too is that I do know that some buying organizations that have fairly complex distribution workflows between what they receive and where they end up just delivering it to restaurants or stores and things like that. Some are already indicating that they are going to look for the same level of trace across any produce commodity, which kind of speaks a little bit to that question as well. If you only sell half of the things you sell are FSMA related items, half aren't. There may be some buyers that just message to their supplier community that they want this level of trace on everything, and so that could throw some complexity into it. It's really going to be on a buyer, as we see with a lot of things in the supply chain with produce, is really kind of the buyers sometimes are able to dictate what they're looking for, and it may be that buyers find that it's more realistic for them to comply if they just treat all produce the same, rather than try and work out mechanisms within their distribution network to segregate, FSMA and non-FSMA compliant product. Similar things we were seeing throughout the years with organics, where certain sections of a DC or a cooler need to be segregated and only handle organic product versus conventional. There's a lot of effort in segregating that out, and so I can't say what's going to be finalized, but I do know that I've heard several buyers provide initial feedback that it's probably going to be more realistic for them to just do this for all produce and not just the FSMA FTL products.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we are at time. I do see a couple more questions coming in here about very specific questions about exemptions and some other things like that. I think it's probably telling that we should continue to do these sessions and provide that additional clarity. So be on the lookout for additional sessions to be scheduled and messaged to you. Anyone that has put their information in here looking for a follow-up, we will follow up with you, and we appreciate everyone's time. So thank you. Thanks,
Thanks,
Jason.
everybody.